The NATO summit got off to a very testy start today in Brussels. U.S. President Donald Trump doubled down on his calls for alliance members to step up defense spending. But this time, he wants countries to double the target from 2% of GDP to 4%. The CBC's Catherine Cullen has more from the Belgian capital.
It's an unfair burden on the United States.
Breakfast wasn't even served.
Good morning, everybody.
When Donald Trump picked his first fight of the day with NATO.
How can you be together when a country is getting its energy from the person you want protection against or from the group that you want protection?
Because we understand that when we stand together also when dealing with Russia, we are stronger. I think what we have seen is that...
No, you're just making Russia richer.
Well,
you're not dealing with Russia, you're making Russia richer.
What Trump wants is for other NATO countries to live up to their commitments and spend more on their militaries. Today, Canada announced it would step up in Iraq.
We were actually offering to command that mission for the first year. This is something that we believe in deeply.
But that doesn't mean spending more. Canada is already in Iraq. Now it will take on a more high-profile role, training trainers in a NATO mission. Add that to yesterday's announcement, a 4-year extension leading the NATO mission in Latvia. That still doesn't get Canada to NATO's spending targets, 2% of a country's economic output. While Trudeau is supporting NATO's goals, he's also saying Canada won't get there.
We don't think about, who's doing more, who's doing less. We will do what we can and what we feel is right.
Now, Trudeau and Trump did speak today. We know that trade came up, but no word on NATO spending. Trump, though, is trying to up the pressure on all members of the NATO alliance. Today, he suggested raising that military spending target, doubling it, in fact, to 4%. The Secretary General of NATO said that to start, he thinks the focus should remain on having everyone reach that initial 2% goal. Vashi?
Thanks, Catherine. Catherine Cullen in Brussels. So what's at stake here? Could we see a weakening of the 70-year alliance? Joining me now from Quebec City is Yves Brodeur. He served as Canadian ambassador to NATO from 2011 to 2015. And in Chicago, Ivo Dalder. He served as U.S. ambassador to NATO from 2009 to 2013. Hi to both of you. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Pleasure.
Ambassador Dalder, I'll start with you. I'm sure you've seen the tape from Donald Trump's meeting this morning with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, where he called allies, quote, delinquent for failing to spend enough on defense, and then said Germany was a captive of Russia. What were you thinking as you watched it unfold?
It's not a NATO that I recognize, or indeed an American president that I recognize in these kinds of conversations. For 70 years, the United States has been a leading actor within NATO and within Europe. We always want the Europeans to do their fair share, and every president, from Harry S. Truman on, has said that Europe needs to do more on defense. But there's so much more to NATO than just the question of how much a percentage of GDP we're spending on defense. It's about shared values and shared interests and protecting and advancing those interests. And indeed, so much is happening in Brussels today that's positive in that regard, that these kinds of comments are unfortunately overshadowing it.
Mr. Brodeur, Ambassador Dalder mentioned the percentage of GDP spent on defense, and today Mr. Trump even said it should be 4%, and that 2024 is too long a time to wait for countries to meet the 2% goal. What's going through your head as you listen to all this and you watch it unfold?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I share Ivo Dalder's impression. It's a bit sad to actually try and limit the importance of NATO to an accounting exercise. Money is important, but it's not all. The main asset of NATO is solidarity and unity. And I think we're just missing an opportunity here to put the emphasis on that precisely. This is a time where we need to demonstrate to the world, to Russia, that we are united and that solidarity remains solid and firm. At the end of the day, the 2% is a target, and I note, for instance, that all NATO allies are on a path to meet that target at some point. But
Canada
again,
isn't, but
well, Canada is. It will take 10 years, as Prime Minister said. But again, the issue is what you do with that. But no question how you look at this. NATO is a success story. It's been building democracy, freedom, stability, peace for 70 years. And I think there's something that that upsets me in trying to pretend that it's all based on money and that perhaps the burden of global security falls on the shoulder of one nation. That's not right. It's not correct. And it's forgetting how much allies, all allies, new and old, have been contributing to establish this vast area of peace and solidarity.
Mr. Dowler, when Mr. Brodeur talks about demonstrating unity, especially insofar as Russia is concerned, how is that, or is it undermined at all by the meeting that's about to happen very soon with President Trump?
Well, I do think that the NATO, as it met today, agreed on a very strong statement to bolster defense and deterrence in Europe, to stand up against Russia and make clear that the aggression we have seen from Russia in Ukraine is completely and totally unacceptable and needs to be reversed. So we have the capacity here for President Trump to depart Brussels with a united NATO behind him, and for him to then have a conversation with Mr. Putin on how we can overcome the differences that are very, very real. After all, it's Russia that has interfered in our elections here in the United States and indeed in other countries. It is Russia that for the first time since 1945 used force to change borders when it invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. It is Russia that has been engaged in an indiscriminate bombing campaign in Syria and is supporting a leader in Syria that is using chemical weapons. And if the president comes to Helsinki and says, these are our differences and let's move forward figuring out how we can overcome them, how we can get you back into the community of nations, which is where NATO stands and we want Russia to come in, that will be a very productive meeting.
What happens, Mr. Brodeur, if instead he goes into that meeting with a divided NATO behind him?
Well, as Ambassador Dollar just said, there's a pretty strong statement that's coming out of NATO about Russia. I think the key point here, and I'd like to share Ambassador Dollar's optimism, I'm not sure I can, about what kind of message President Trump will deliver to Mr. Putin. Looking at it from a Canadian perspective, just coming out of the G7 summit, where the President of the United States was sitting with allies, a very select group of allies, very close to the United States, where a couple of days later, the first thing he does is to actually renegade on some of the accomplishment of that summit. So I just wish, it is my wish, that actually President Trump does deliver a very strong message. If he doesn't, then I think this is going to undermine the credibility and the legitimacy of NATO.
What are the consequences, Ambassador, of that credibility of NATO being undermined?
Well, I think that bottom line is that at the minute you start to actually inject doubt in the willingness of NATO allies to come forward collectively to guarantee or safeguard the safety of another ally, and I would include the United States in that, Canada, all of the allies, then all bets are open. Again, NATO's strength is based on the assumption that collective security is guaranteed and that allies will actually come to the support of any ally falling under attack. And that is what NATO is all about, again, solidarity and unity.
Before I let you both go, I just wanted to ask sort of a devil's advocate question. Has Mr. Trump's pressure actually worked, insofar as at least defense spending is concerned? I note in one of your pieces, Mr. Dollar, you mentioned that by 2024 now, at least 18 allies will have met the spending target. We have seen an acceleration since the pressure went up from Mr. Trump here in Canada. I'll start with you, Mr. Dollar. Does he deserve some credit for that?
Yeah, sure, he deserves some credit for it, but the real reason defense spending is going up, and it's been going up for the last 4 years, by $87 billion. Non-U.S. NATO defense spending has gone up by $87 billion since 2014. It's what happened in 2014. It's when Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. At that point, there was the agreement for those countries who were not spending 2% on GDP to move towards that target within a decade, and they're doing so. Mr. Trump is emphasizing the importance of this, and clearly people want to stay on the right side of the United States because the United States is the major leading power in NATO, and so they will hopefully continue to do this.
Mr. Brodeur, what do you think?
I will just say, again, taking it from a Canadian point of view, can we do more? Should we do more? The answer is unequivocally yes, we should, but not because Mr. Trump is asking us to do that. It's because of our sovereignty demands it. That's one thing. The second thing is that also our men and women in the forces deserve the best possible equipment, especially if we're going to put them in harm's way, within NATO or not. And from that perspective, I definitely believe that we do have in Canada an obligation to look seriously at our defense budget expenditure in a way that would actually not only increase it, but give us the tools we need to do the job. So, but I do share the analysis that Ambassador Dalder just provided.
Okay, I have to leave it there, but thank you both very much for your time. Thanks to Ivo Dalder and Yves Brodeur.
You're very welcome. Goodbye, Ivo.
My pleasure.